All right, this video covers the pineal gland. We're going to look at the anatomy and physiology of the gland, the major pineal secretions, primarily melatonin, and I'll say a little bit about some pathologies and talk a bit about sleep disorders, although I'm not going to focus as much on that. So we'll talk a bit about the history of the gland, again the anatomy, the function, clinical significance. Not a lot of disorders with the pineal. We'll see there's a tendency towards calcification of the pineal as we get older, and then potentially tumors of the pineal gland. We'll look at melatonin and all of its functions, and then how to measure it, and then again I'll just say a few things about sleep disorders. So the pineal gland, also known as the epiphysis, is a very small gland. It's about the size of a large grain of rice, about 5 to 8 millimeters in humans. It produces melatonin and some other hormones it's a little controversial about how much of these other hormones it actually secretes, but we usually think of it as melatonin. One thing I should say is that the pineal gland is only found in vertebrates, although we see some sort of early signs of what we might call a pre-pineal in lower animals as well. It's reddish-gray in color. Has a little stalk called the pineal stalk, and interestingly the size of the pineal increases in colder environments, particularly in vertebrates that live in cold environments like Arctic seals and whatnot. They have very, very large pineal glands. It's shaped a bit like a pine cone, which is where the name pineal comes from. That's the Latin pinea, which means pine cone, and it's also called the conarium, again from the pine cone, or epiphysis cerebri. So some other names you might hear it referred to. It's located near the center of the brain. So here it is. A lot of people think that the pineal is sort of a light sensing organ because it is in lower vertebrates. I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But notice that in humans it is completely enveloped by the cerebral cortex. So there's no place in the pineal where it's in contact directly with light. However, through nerve pathways and through the hypothalamus and the retina, it actually is influenced by light rhythms, and so I'll talk about that reflex here coming up. It's located between the two cerebral hemispheres and between the two thalamic bodies. So here's the thalamus in the middle. It's kind of sliced in half, midsection here. Here's a little stalk that connects the two sides of the thalamus. And remember that between the thalamic bodies we have the third ventricle, and then we have coming down the back here we have the cerebral aqueduct and the fourth ventricle. So the pineal is intimately connected with the cerebral spinal fluid. It's bathed actually in CSF. There's a small pineal recess where CSF directly contacts the pineal gland. So it's considered what we call this a circumventricular organ. There are several organs which are found around the ventricles which have no blood-brain barrier, and that makes it important because they can directly sense different substances in the blood, and pineal is one of those, so it's more in contact with what's going on in your general metabolism. Here it is from the back side. It's kind of hanging down. It's part of what's called the diencephalon, the middle part of the brain, which includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Here's the hypothalamus here. And it kind of hangs on its little stalk between these two little bulbs. These are the superior colliculi. Here are the inferior colliculi. And this is the back part, right up here, of the midbrain. So the midbrain is this structure here. And it's kind of divided on the back side by the cerebral aqueduct. So here's the anterior midbrain, and here's the posterior. So it's hanging between the colliculi and the posterior midbrain. And why this is important is that any enlargement of the pineal, such as rarely from the pineal tumor, can press on the colliculus here. And the superior colliculi are important because they are where we regulate our visual muscles. So basically when you see a bright light and your head turns towards that process is regulated by your superior colliculus. So any pressure on that might actually contribute problems. In fact, patients with very large pineal tumors can't actually gaze upward. They have what's called an upward gaze palsy because of that. So right there between the two colliculi. The superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi are part of the corpora quadrigemina. And again, that's part of the tectum, which is the back part of the midbrain. So just some terms to keep in mind here. Now I mentioned that nearly all vertebrates have a pineal gland. There's a couple of exceptions. The hagfish, although it has sort of a vestigial or a pre-pineal organ. In lower vertebrates, the pineal is a type of atrophied photoreceptor. So you can see it here in the frog. This little white bump right here, that's the pineal is right underneath that. And here you see in the lizard, there's a little area here. So in these animals, the pineal actually is photosensitive. So it's responding to external light rhythms. And so this is called the parietal eye. That's what you can think of that as sort of a third eye. So that's the case in lower vertebrates. But again, as we go up the vertebrate ladder into mammals, for example, you find that the pineal gland is completely encased by the cerebrum. And so its only connection with light is going to be actually through nerves and nerve pathways. Now, very interesting history around the pineal gland. In ancient Egypt, this was called the Eye of Horus, or part of the Eye of Horus. So there was a symbol of the mystery schools, the schools where students were led through special initiations to allow them supposedly to see, experience things in the so-called spiritual world, parallel planes of reality to this physical world. And this wedged eye was a symbol that was often in temples and whatnot, which indicated that this was a mystery school center. But the wedged eye is interesting because if you look at the different components, it just looks like an eye with this sort of curly thing here and a little handle. But if you kind of compare that to the brain structures, we can kind of think of this upper part as corresponding to the corpus callosum. We have the thalamus here in the middle, the hypothalamus down here, the medulla here in the brainstem hanging off, and then the pineal gland would be in this posterior portion here. So in a way, the pineal and this center section, this so-called diencephalon region of the brain, was perceived in the mystery schools to be an essential place to develop in the student for perception of more what we might call supersensory realities. It was thought to connect one to the afterlife, or what in the Western tradition was known as the astral world. And it was sort of a symbol for psychic activity and psychic training. Herophilus, a Greek philosopher, associated pineal gland with memory. And then it was Descartes in his Treatise of Man in the 1600s, which essentially regarded the pineal as the principal seat of the soul. By Descartes' time, it was thought that the soul, which we might talk about as our body, the part of us which includes our feelings, our thoughts, our inner impressions, all of that, more the non-tangible aspect of us, the soul, by the time of Descartes, was only thought to reside in one part of the body, and that was the pineal gland. The rest of our organs and whatnot were thought to be soulless, essentially, and the body was thought to be a giant machine. And so it was appropriate to dissect and study all of those things as long as one didn't touch the pineal gland, because that was thought to be a sacred gland. Interestingly, just 100, 200 years after Descartes, the soul entirely was thrown from the body, and the pineal just became another endocrine gland in a way. Here's a picture actually from the Treatise of Man down here in the bottom right. See the sort of pineal as sort of an orchestrating place between the outer world, our inner world, and then all the muscle, mechanical activity and so forth. Madame Blavatsky, who was the founder of Theosophy in the late 1800s, argued that the pineal is sort of the seat of the psychic third eye, again going back to more ancient Egyptian mystery teachings. That the pineal was a type of photoreceptor for the spirit, for again, supersensory aspects of this. Now, I've been using the words soul and spirit here interchangeably. I would just say in these old traditions, actually, they were considered separate. The soul was thought to be more related to our individual personality, our inner feelings, our belief systems and whatnot, whereas spirit referred to more of a sort of higher aspect of us. I might call that our higher self, those things that transcend our normal personality. So in Blavatsky's time, it was thought that the pineal actually was a direct receiver from the higher self into the body for insight, for intuition, and those sorts of things. So this interesting idea in all these different traditions of the pineal is a sort of type of antenna. And you actually find images of the pineal in a lot of artwork. So outside the Vatican, for example, there's a giant pine cone statue, which is kind of weird if you think, what's this pine cone doing here? But it's actually a symbol for the pineal. You also see that in a lot of Hindu temple carvings and whatnot in India, these little pine cone figures, which again are images of the pineal gland. So a lot of interesting correlations there. Blavatsky argued that the pineal was a seat of the so-called third eye. Others have argued the pituitary is more the third eye, and I think the most convincing argument I've had is that when you develop certain inner practices through meditation, you essentially create a type of current across the third ventricle between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and pineal. Almost think of it like an electrical current there. And that allows the proper perception of these higher realities. So again, we're going off base here a little bit and talking about more esoteric subjects rather than just physiology. But I think it's interesting that you have this connection with the center of the brain and all the different organs, with the possibility, at least in people, that we can develop higher powers of cognition and so forth. And so the pineal is an intimate part of that. Now, the blood supply to the pineal is interesting. It's supplied primarily by the posterior cerebral artery. Remember, we have an anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral artery, as well as the basilar artery. So we see branches from the posterior cerebral artery. And the blood flow that goes through the pineal is actually amazingly large. So it has a very profuse supply of arterial blood, second only to the kidney in the body. The kidneys consume about 20% of your cardiac output in terms of oxygen and nutrients and whatnot. So see, the pineal is kind of like the kidney in that way. It's very related to uptake of oxygen and utilization of the blood. And importantly, there's no blood-brain barrier in the pineal capillaries. So the pineal is able to sense and be regulated in some ways by what's actually in the plasma. Now, there's also sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve supplies to the pineal. We'll talk about the sympathetics in detail here in just a moment. They're going to be important for actually connecting the pineal with light rhythms. And that's going to be part of something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus melatonin loop. And I'll talk about that in just a minute here. There's also parasympathetic innervation, which comes from the parieto-palatine and the otic ganglia. This is not understood as well as the sympathetic supply. In fact, a lot of physiologists say it has no real role, but that's probably an understatement. I'd imagine that we're going to discover some important functions there. But at the moment, we don't think the parasympathetics are as significant for pineal physiology. There's also central innervation via the pineal stalk. And then there's actually some neurons from the trigeminal ganglia, which contain specific neuropeptides, and those can be activated sometimes in migraine headaches. Again, the significance there is not quite known. So again, I mentioned that the pineal is not in direct contact with outer light. So here's how the process works. So in your retina, you of course know of your rod and cone cells. The rods are primarily responding to sort of grayish blue-green light, so they're your kind of black and white color vision. The cones are related to more color vision. Then you have a third type of cell, which actually lies in front of the retina. Remember, the retina is situated, it's built very interestingly, where the light-sensitive cells are on the backside, and in front of them are blood vessels, different nerves, and whatnot. So the light coming in from the outside has to go through those outer layers first before it hits the light-sensitive cells. Well, one of those outer layers is called the ganglion cell layer. And the ganglion cells have a third type of photoreceptor, which is specific for blue light. And that's around 460 to 480 nanometers. That's basically the blue of the sky. So when you wake up in the morning, it's hopefully a sunny day, you look outside, you get the blue sky, that activates those photoreceptors, and that carries an impulse via the optic nerve back to the hypothalamus. And that essentially sends a signal in the hypothalamus to that region I pointed out in the previous video called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. And that essentially synchronizes the SCN to the day-night cycle. Curiously, if you keep people underground without a natural light source and don't give them a clock and just say, well, tell us what time you think it is, people will actually synchronize their activities to a 25-hour rhythm. And that's actually a lunar cycle. So we can say our bodies are sort of built in the dark to a lunar cycle, but it's the sun and the light exposure on the ganglion cells which sets the suprachiasmatic nucleus to a 24-hour rhythm. So this is why exposure to blue light can be very important for people that have circadian disruption at the right times. So you have to expose yourself to blue light in the morning time. It only takes about 15 or 20 minutes. Again, you don't need full spectrum light. You can just use the blue light, and that's why blue light lamps are very popular now. And that will actually reset your circadian rhythm. Unfortunately, if you stare at blue light at night before sleep, that's going to go further, and that's going to have a negative effect on melatonin. So what happens is the SCN, through nerve fibers, is going to actually send information up to what's called the paraventricular nucleus in the hypothalamus. This is just another center in the hypothalamus. From the paraventricular nucleus, nerves will go down the spinal cord via the interior medial lateral column, and they're going to go and output via sympathetic nerves in your upper thorax, and then they're going to synapse onto nerves in your cervical spine, and that's the so-called superior cervical ganglia. So in this picture to the right, I can draw this up here. Here we see the light coming in, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Here's the hypothalamus, sends nerves down the spinal cord. It's going to go out the spinal cord to the superior cervical ganglia, and from the superior cervical ganglia, it's going to travel back up, back into the skull, and that is going to then travel to the pineal gland. So this is how the pineal gland is going to be sensitive to light. When the light stimulation is on, when you're getting exposed to light, that effectively is going to shut off the pineal gland. When the light stimulation is off at night, that is going to turn on the pineal gland. And the way the pineal gland turns on is that actually those nerves will start to secrete norepinephrine. So essentially that's going to stimulate. So norepinephrine is released onto the pineal gland when the light is absent. And it's going to bind to beta-1 and alpha-1 receptors on the cells of the pineal called pineal sites. And that's going to upregulate the enzymes that synthesize melatonin. So that's how melatonin is, or how the pineal gland senses light in higher vertebrates where the pineal is no longer in direct contact with the outer light. It's kind of a weird sort of progression there where the nerve impulses have to go down into your neck and then back up to the pineal gland. If you look at blue light at night before bed, you essentially will turn off the norepinephrine secretion, and so that will essentially suppress melatonin secretion. You'll get no melatonin synthesis activity, which is why you don't want to stare at the blue lights at night. A lot of computer screens, of course, have that, but unfortunately the compact fluorescents are pretty blue, and so just having your lights on, the new high-efficiency bulbs often will cause that. Light engineers are now putting red back into those lights, just like the old incandescent bulbs are more red, and that actually can help prevent that from happening. Red light doesn't have an effect on this. So that's the suprachiasmatic nucleus melatonin loop. So if we look at the microanatomy of the pineal gland, we have the parenchyma, which is the actual working tissue, and that's primarily pineal sites, together with 4 other different types of cells. I'll talk about that in a moment here. There's connective tissue, then there's a surface capsule called the pial capsule, and then interestingly, buried in the connective tissue, there are often large amounts of calcium deposits, especially as we get older, and that is known as the corpora arenacea, or brain sand. And I'll look at that in more detail. We have a lot of interesting new theories about how if we over-calcify the pineal, that actually can be associated with different pathologies. These crystals are primarily calcium phosphate, a little bit of magnesium phosphate, so it's the same you see in bone So it's like a bone formation happening in the wrong place or at an accelerated rate. Interestingly, recently, calcite crystals have been discovered. That's calcium carbonate. And what's interesting about calcite is that it's piezoelectric. Piezoelectric crystals, if you compress them mechanically, will release light or electricity. So very interesting how different meditation practices actually encourage a type of breathing which is thought to pump the cerebral spinal fluid up against the pineal gland. And that could be enough to actually compress it, causing this inner light release or electrical current release and so forth. So kind of an interesting little correlation there. The pineal sites are the main cells that secrete melatonin. They have a cell body with these little cytoplasmic processes, almost like little arms, and they produce and secrete melatonin, and it stains in a lightly basophilic manner. There are interstitial cells. These are sort of the equivalents of astrocytes in the pineal gland. And they're supporting cells, and just like astrocytes do to neurons, they help support the pineal sites. There are perivascular phagocytes, which are equivalent to microglia, and they're located close to the capillaries, and they, we know, can act as antigen-presenting cells. So there's sort of an immune sensing aspect to the pineal gland. There are pineal neurons, which are, again, coming from the central nervous system. And then there are what are called peptidergic neuron-like cells, and they have sort of a paracrine regulatory activity. So these are the different cell types of the pineal. The pineal grows in size until about age 1.5 to 2, and the weight gradually increases from puberty onwards. And we see very large amounts of melatonin synthesis in children. And where we think that is important is that melatonin in high levels suppresses sexual development. It suppresses the development of your sex hormones and suppresses the development of the gonads. So the reason puberty essentially is delayed, one of the main reasons, is that you secrete large amounts of melatonin. And we think that's happening because melatonin has a lot of regulatory effects on growth, on skeletal muscle growth, body growth, and really in the first 14 years is when you're sort of growing your frame, putting everything on, filling out everything. And we don't need the sexual development to occur just then. So melatonin has an inhibiting role on the sex organs. Pineal tumors, which I'll talk about here in just a moment, can actually suppress, they can prevent that melatonin from being secreted. So one would tend to have precocious puberty in those cases. So that's one of the differentials actually for a child that's developing very early puberty is, do we need to get an MRI to look for a potential pineal tumor? It's going to be pretty low on the list in terms of all the other possibilities, but something to think about. So of course, when we think of the pineal gland, we think of melatonin. This is by far the major secretion of the pineal, but there are other hormones as well. And the hormones from the pineal are secreted into two fluids. One is the blood directly, so into the plasma, but the other is the cerebral spinal fluid. Both of these follow circadian rhythms, although here's an interesting little tidbit. Your GI tract actually also secretes melatonin. In fact, it secretes over 400 times the amount of melatonin that the pineal gland secretes. But here's the interesting feature. Your GI melatonin is going to be really secreted mostly after each meal. So as melatonin is synthesized from tryptophan, as you eat foods rich in tryptophan, you can get a surge of melatonin in the blood from the GI tract. But it's the pineal melatonin which secretes the melatonin in the circadian rhythm. It's highest at night, lowest during the day, and also secretes it into the cerebral spinal fluid. So your GI melatonin, what you absorb from the GI tract, and that would include melatonin supplements, doesn't really affect your cerebral spinal fluid melatonin. And we'll see that's really important because, interestingly, things like skeletal muscle growth and whatnot is very dependent on the cerebral spinal fluid levels of melatonin, not so much on your plasma melatonin. So the hormones are secreted both in the CSF and the plasma. Maybe the CSF is more important, especially for the circadian rhythm regulation. So we have melatonin, our primary hormone. It's regulated by external light, regulates your circadian rhythms and reproductive hormones. I'll come back to all the functions of melatonin in a bit. Also is a very potent antioxidant. We also secrete small amounts, and again, the controversy is, does it make a difference based on the amount? But remember that we have hormones that are secreted at 10 to the minus 12 dilution, and we have profound effects from those hormones. So could it be that a very, very tiny amount of these hormones can make a difference? Absolutely. So dimethyltryptamine, DMT, this is a potent psychedelic molecule. This is the main active constituent in ayahuasca. Interestingly, we make it in the pineal gland. Its synthesis is larger actually at birth or very early life. We also think it might be associated with dying. So as you die, it's thought that maybe the pineal secretes a surge of DMT into the cerebral spinal fluid and you have out-of-body experiences. Could those meditation practices that I talked about, practice in ancient Egypt and whatnot, that whole inner mystery school with the wedged eye and whatnot, could they be referring to practices that increase the DMT secretion? These would be very materialistic explanations for psychic phenomena, but I think that this could be a parallel in the physical to those higher activities. So there are some people who really promote this idea that the third eye experience, the meditative experience, comes from the DMT, and that it leads to sort of out-of-body or suprasensory experiences. Again, it's controversial because the level is secreted in very, very tiny amounts. I haven't been able to find a number for what the levels are, but I'm guessing they're probably 10 to the minus 12th or higher in dilution. Another hormone that's secreted in tiny amounts is pinealine. Pinealine is a beta-carboline. This is an MAO inhibitor. And this is interesting because in ayahuasca, for example, it's not just one plant, it's a blend of plants. One of the plants has the DMT, but there are other plants that are added that actually have MAO inhibitors. And that's important because if you take DMT orally, your GI mucosa would actually metabolize it, so you don't get an effect orally. To really get the DMT effect without an MAOI, you'd have to use it parentally. And there have been experiments with patients using intravenous DMT, which is quite an interesting phenomena. Peter Strassman is a researcher who wrote a book about that called The Spirit Molecule, where he talks about some of his research. Basically, so DMT is broken down, but if you add an MAOI, that prevents that. So the pineal, interestingly, also secretes an MAOI along with the DMT, which would mean it would keep it around longer from being metabolized. Again, the levels are very small, so it's sort of controversial in terms of how significant that is. And then interestingly, there are a number of neurosteroids also produced by the pineal, and that would include testosterone, both alpha and 5-alpha, 5-beta dihydrotestosterone. These are very active forms of testosterone. 7-alpha hydroxypregnenolone. Pregnenolone is sort of a master hormone, but it has, all these hormones are called neurosteroids because they have an effect on nerve tissue. And they can support glial cell function as well as neuron function. And then 17-beta estradiol, which is E2. So the pineal secretes very tiny amounts of sex hormones, interestingly. So those are all the kind of different hormones we know currently. I'm sure we'll discover others as time goes on that the pineal secretes. So before talking about melatonin in more detail, just talk about a couple of pineal pathologies. The first is the pineal gland calcification, PGC, that I already talked about. And that's where the pineal becomes calcified with age. And we essentially have this corpora arenacea, or brain sand, that accumulates, which is made primarily of calcium crystals, phosphates, carbonate, and so forth. We see it in children as young as 2 years of age. And we see in about 40% of Americans, by the age of 17, their pineals are quite calcified. And the reason we can see that is on MRI, it shows up very brightly as a bright spot when there's a bunch of calcium. In fact, this is actually used as a landmark to sort of situate the MRI image using the pineal calcification. And the process that the pineal calcifies through is exactly the same that happens in bone. So there's a connection with pineal and bone. I'll come back to that one here in just a minute. Again, it's mostly calcium and phosphates, very similar to the apatite in bone. We definitely know it's correlated with aging. And again, it's visible in X-ray or CT, MRI, as a landmark. Now, curiously, fluoride, which of course we think about as a tooth hardener for your enamel, it has been shown and connected with the idea that this also causes the pineal to calcify, usually at a very early age. So this is another concern about fluoride treatments, is that they might be causing pineal calcification. What does that mean? Well, we don't really know. We do know that in later life, excess calcification of the pineal is correlated with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. And so that's an interesting connection now. We're finding that maybe too much pineal calcification leads to problems like Alzheimer's. This hardening process in traditions like anthroposophic medicine is correlated with a hardening also in our thinking, where instead of having freely creative thinking, intellectual, dry, linear, robotic thinking is what we can think of as what's happening with pineal calcification. So could it be that the calcification of the pineal is correlated with less creativity in our thinking? Of course, we don't have a lot of robust evidence for that. That's just a speculation. But I think that's something to reflect on, how maybe decalcifying the pineal, you see that a lot out there. Whether or not that can happen or not is controversial. But the idea that maybe through meditative practices and so forth, we can actually reverse some of that and maybe restore in our thinking more flexibility and so forth. Again, these are all controversial and hypothetical associations. But we definitely do know the calcification is correlated with neurodegenerative diseases. Again, though, in medicine, we have to be very careful about connecting correlation with cause. We tend to do that a lot. Just because something is correlated doesn't mean it's a cause of this or that. It might just mean that they're both products of a similar underlying pathology. So with the pineal gland, another type of pathology would be tumors, and that would be pinealomas or germ cell tumors, pineoblastomas, or mix between the two. And these usually are detected early in life, pre-puberty. This again might lead to precocious puberty. So our symptoms might include increased intracranial pressure. Remember that the pineal is sitting right there on the back side of the midbrain. If the gland enlarges, it can compress the tectum, and that would essentially compress the cerebral aqueduct, and that could create an obstructive hydrocephalus. So now we have increased intracranial pressure, headaches, and so forth. Visual abnormalities because of compression on the superior colliculi. So that would include what's called perinode syndrome, which is where a person can't look upward. It's called an upward gaze palsy. They would also have an absent pupillary light reflex. And that's because that light reflex is regulated through cranial nerve number 3, and the cell bodies for cranial nerve number 3 are right there next to the colliculi. So again, if they're compressed, that might result in problems there. Also, paralysis of convergence, and then a wide base gait, and that's partly because the visual impulses are not giving a steady read on the world, and so a person feels unsteady, unstable. There can also be a loss of the melatonin, which would then cause potentially early puberty because it's no longer suppressing the sex hormones, and can also suppress other hypothalamic hormones. Finally, visual abnormalities because of changes with the optic nerve as these structures enlarge. And the optic nerve, of course, is much more anterior, but this could be with the increased hydrocephalus and so forth that might create problems there. So those would all be typical signs and symptoms of pineal tumors. Very rare, but something to have on your radar. I've seen in 21 plus years of practice, one case where it was demonstrated on MRI that this person had a pineal gland, which was quite enlarged, but didn't seem to be causing any symptoms, and we thought it was maybe just an incidental thing, and the neurologist wasn't too worried about it, thought we should just track and wait, and it didn't end up growing over time. It was probably there all this person's life. The treatment can be surgical, although it's very difficult to reach this part of the brain. But the idea would be to try to decompress, so remove some of the pressure, maybe open up the cerebral aqueduct, allow the cerebral spinal fluid to go through. Potentially targeted radiation therapy, and then hormone replacement, especially melatonin. So those are primarily the pathologies of the gland itself, the pineal gland, in terms of the extremes that we might see. Again, a lot of the problems with the pineal that we see clinically are typically related more to melatonin fluctuations, and that can result in problems with sleep rhythms and so forth. So that's what I'll be focusing on for the rest of this discussion. So melatonin is secreted by pineal sites, and it's derived from serotonin, which of course in turn is derived from tryptophan. Psychoactive drugs like cannabis and LSD will all increase synthesis of melatonin, and the indolic hallucinogenic drugs, again LSD, the mushrooms and so forth, will all emulate melatonin activity. So again, this sort of connection with out-of-body experiences, hallucinations, pineal, melatonin, etc. There's a lot of micronutrients needed for melatonin, so iron, magnesium, zinc would be our three basic metals that we might need in small amounts. Vitamin B6, especially the activated form, P5P, methylated folate, and B12. Nearly all tissues, interestingly, can synthesize melatonin. So again, we don't want to think about it as just a hormone of the pineal gland, but the pineal kind of is the master regulator for setting the circadian rhythms for melatonin. So we found melatonin synthesis to occur in the skin. This is very important. In fact, I'll talk a bit about skin disorders and melatonin. Strong connection there. The lens of the eye, the ciliary body of the eye, the gut, again over 400 times the amount of melatonin in the gut from the pineal gland. Primarily secreted by enterochromaffin cells, are the same ones that secrete serotonin. Bone marrow, another big one that secretes melatonin. The testes, ovaries, uterus, placenta, oocytes, the eggs, red blood cells, platelets, lymphocytes, astrocytes, mast cells, and neurons all can secrete melatonin. In the gut, again, 400 times more melatonin than the pineal, and that's going to supply primarily the plasma. That's not going to influence the cerebral spinal fluid levels of melatonin as much. The extrapineal sources of melatonin, just by quantity, are far greater than the pineal-derived melatonin. But the pineal, again, has this important function of regulating circadian rhythms, especially in the CSF. We think the extrapineal melatonin has more of a local antioxidant or an autocrine paracrine effects on tissues. Now, melatonin is also secreted by plants. And so this is interesting because this is an example of a plant hormone or phytohormone which regulates growth and photosynthesis. And I'll talk about that here in just a minute. Here is the synthesis pathway for melatonin. The parts highlighted here in yellow are occurring only in the pineal gland. Again, any tissue that makes melatonin would have this as well. The other steps here can occur outside. So basically, we use serotonin or 5-HT as a substrate. 5-HTP in turn comes from 5-HTP and then tryptophan. Remember that tryptophan, when you take it orally, gets into the blood. It can't cross the blood-brain barrier. It has to be transported via an amino acid transporter. That transporter competes for all other amino acids as well. And so basically, tryptophan is not absorbed particularly quickly into the brain. 5-HTP, however, is absorbed. So if we gave a person 5-HTP, we get an upregulation of 5-HTP into the brain, serotonin, and then through these enzymatic steps, there's two of them, we convert the serotonin first into N-acetylserotonin and then finally into melatonin. The effect of the absence of light on the retina, which activates those sympathetic nerves, essentially is going to increase the activity of this enzyme here. So that will then cause more melatonin to be secreted. This is a breakdown product, the 5-hydroxy indolacetic acid. This is 5-HIA. This is HIAA. This is the breakdown product of serotonin, which we can often find in the urine, for example. So that's the basic synthesis pathway for melatonin. And again, many of these enzymes need these metals and vitamin cofactors to properly function. So again, in place of giving melatonin, one of the things we might want to think about is just giving micronutrient therapy. Maybe a person needs a little bit of zinc, or maybe they need B vitamins, or more 5-HTP can be used so the body can upregulate melatonin in its own rhythm and so forth. That's going to be very different than just supplying the melatonin orally, because again, that's not going to affect your cerebral spinal fluid levels very well, which is, we think, very important for regulating brain health and sleep rhythms. You won't get a lot of the nuanced effects of melatonin just by giving it orally that way. So again, the secretory peak of melatonin is at night. So if you look at this diagram to the right, you see at 6 p.m., very low melatonin levels. And then as we go to sleep, we get a peak usually around midnight, first couple hours after midnight, and then it starts to go down again. And then during the day, our melatonin levels are relatively low. And this is, of course, assuming a proper sleep rhythm and so on and so forth. The serotonin, again, is a precursor. We can think of serotonin as a daytime hormone. It's more of a hormone of waking consciousness, and then melatonin is your nighttime hormone, which is more associated here with sleep induction and so forth. It's a little inappropriate to call melatonin a sleep hormone. It's better to call it a nighttime hormone. There's many factors that affect sleep. Melatonin is only one of them. So melatonin, when we give that, let's say as a supplement in the low dosage, 1 milligram or 0.5 milligrams, really is working to maybe induce sleep. Not so good at keeping you asleep, but it can help maybe with sleep induction by getting the body prepared to go into a sleeping state. So it's not technically a sleep hormone. Again, it's more of a nighttime hormone. Now, once the melatonin is secreted into the plasma or the cerebral spinal fluid, the way cells are able to respond to it is via melatonin receptors. And there are two basic types, sort of a third subtype, but basically melatonin receptor 1, melatonin receptor 2, these are G protein receptors found throughout the body on different cell membranes. And we also suspect there are direct nuclear cell receptors as well. Those functions aren't quite as well known, but basically the effect would be to regulate cellular metabolism, start to initiate second messenger signaling, and maybe affect gene transcription and translation. A second way that melatonin works beyond coupling with its receptors would be as a direct antioxidant. So within mitochondria in particular, it helps promote expression of superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, and reductase, catalase, and so forth. And so all of these effects, this upregulation of cellular antioxidants, occurs when the melatonin binds to its receptors, or melatonin directly diffuses into the cell and works that way. So that's another effect of melatonin, direct antioxidant effects. Very important antioxidant for the brain and for nervous system health. That's why, again, we see large amounts of it in the cerebral spinal fluid, sort of bathing all the brain tissues with the melatonin. So melatonin is interesting because it's amphipathic. It's both lipid and water soluble. It crosses the blood-brain, the cell membranes easily, and also can cross the blood-brain barrier. Its endogenous half-life is about 30 minutes, cleared mostly through the liver, and in the urine product is 6-sulfatoxy-melatonin. So that can be measured on urine sampling, not typically done, but there are some companies that can assess the levels of melatonin that way. Again, there's a big question about urinary metabolites for any of these hormones as well as for neurotransmitters. Is it really reflecting what's going on inside the blood-brain barrier, inside the cerebral compartment, and so on? That's something we can talk about later. So here's a nice curve again about how the melatonin level really is spiking sort of in the middle of the night, just after midnight, and then falling dramatically by the morning hours. So melatonin is not just in animals, it's also been found in plants. It is a phytohormone, plant hormone. You probably heard of auxins and gibberellins and all those. Those are plant hormones. In fact, that would be an interesting side lecture, is to compare plant hormones with animal and human hormones. But there are many foods that contain large amounts of melatonin. And we think actually when you ingest these foods, you can actually increase your plasma melatonin secretions. Again, you wouldn't increase necessarily your cerebral spinal fluid levels, but you would in the plasma. And so we know a lot of herbs, interestingly, things like passion flower actually contain small amounts of melatonin. Lots of fruits, especially in the rose family, stone fruits, cherries, plums, things like that. Also grapes, bananas, oranges, pineapples, pomegranates, tomatoes, all are very rich in melatonin. Vegetables like asparagus, broccoli, and cucumber, grains even, wheat and barley and so forth have melatonin. Nuts and seeds, olive oil, beans, eggs, meats, fish, milk, some mushrooms, beer and wine, coffee. Again, how much melatonin, does it really make a difference? That depends on the food, depends on how much you ingest. But some of these actually are thought to play a significant role, at least for the plasma levels of melatonin. Again, the melatonin from the pineal is secreted directly into the cerebral spinal fluid via the third ventricle and has direct protective effects on brain tissue. It's antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, anti-apoptotic. So it also has been found to decrease the deposition of beta amyloid. So again, with a calcification of the pineal gland, you get less melatonin. You'd have no ability maybe to stop a lot of that beta amyloid deposition. And also decreased tau protein. So again, we're interested in these in the case looking at things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So we can find melatonin maybe as a protective agent here. Again, this would have to be cerebral spinal fluid melatonin, not plasma. The extrapineal melatonin and the diet-derived melatonin will increase the plasma, but again, won't significantly increase the CSF melatonin. So that's an important one there. This particular diagram came from a study looking at the role at night of the pineal secretion. So you see the CSF levels of melatonin are quite high, but the plasma levels are not as high. So again, this would not be mimicked by getting it through the GI tract. So what are the actions of melatonin? Well, it's many. In fact, we're discovering more all the time. So one is, of course, to work as a nighttime hormone. So melatonin improves sleep latency. That's the onset. And it also has an effect on circadian rhythms. And in life rhythms, it helps to actually prevent early puberty. So that's an important rhythm there. Has direct antioxidant effects, as I mentioned. It's also been found to be a regulator of the immune system. And we think that maybe melatonin levels, if they're adequate, will cause the immune system to shift into a Th3 or regulatory immune response versus a Th1 or Th2, more autoimmune, inflammatory, or allergy responses. So maybe there's an immune role there. In the pituitary, the melatonin has a number of different roles. First of all, it inhibits gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is the main hormone from the hypothalamus, which will trigger the pituitary to release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. This is the one that increases in women in the ovaries estrogen, and luteinizing hormone increases progesterone. So by inhibiting GnRH, you're going to inhibit FSH and LH, and that's going to inhibit gonadal development and decrease libido. So that would, of course, inhibit puberty if it's in early life, but also can decrease libido later in life. Increases prolactin, which also has a further suppressing effect on the gonads. We'll talk about those connections later. It regulates your cortisol rhythm, and we think it decreases nighttime cortisol. So that's a beneficial effect, especially when there's elevated cortisol levels, and no apparent effect on growth hormone. In the bone, very interestingly, we're finding that melatonin is a very important agent for bone health. So there are M2 receptors in bone, and by stimulating those receptors via melatonin, we get increased osteoblast proliferation, differentiation, mineralization. So we make more bone. So there is a new topic that's discussed regarding bone health called the pineal bone axis, how the pineal is an important regulator of skeletal muscle density and bone health. So there's a lot of interest now looking at melatonin as a potential new target for osteoporosis prevention and treatment. So that's a pineal bone connection. In the brain, it protects the neurons and the glia. Importantly, melatonin can augment GABA signaling, so it helps to calm all of your nerve impulses down. High amounts GABA agonists, interestingly, like benzos, unfortunately will inhibit melatonin. So that's an opposite effect where the benzodiazepines, through their receptors, they're working on the GABA receptor, but basically by mimicking GABA, augmenting GABA signaling, they can inhibit melatonin. So you get relaxed, but you don't get the proper melatonin secretion and the benefits of melatonin secretion on brain health and so forth. Melatonin also inhibits glutamate excitotoxicity. Remember that GABA and glutamate are kind of in a seesaw balance, where glutamate is your primary excitatory neurotransmitter, GABA your inhibitory, and people with a lot of overactivity in the central nervous system have too much glutamate and decreased GABA. And so we can think of melatonin as actually helping to right the wheel there, helping to maintain balance. That's where a lot of nervines we'll find is herbs actually have a role. By increasing melatonin, they can actually decrease glutamate excitotoxicity, increase GABA, increase GABA levels. In the skin, melatonin actually regulates the desmosomes, which are the junctions between the epithelial cells, which we think break apart in eczema. And so we think there's a role actually in melatonin in eczema. Number one, just helping people with really itchy skin at night to sleep, but also maybe to heal the skin itself directly. And that would be using oral melatonin. Or again, I would focus on getting the person's endogenous melatonin rhythm reestablished. And I'll talk about beyond the micronutrients. We can talk about some herbs later for that. And then the skin can prevent skin aging. Direct protective effects on the cardiovascular system, protecting endothelium, and it's cardioprotective. In the lungs, interestingly, melatonin might induce bronchoconstriction and potentially worsening asthma, however, protecting a person in COPD. I think one reason asthma might be worse at night is, of course, increased parasympathetic tone, but also potentially more melatonin. Maybe that's why asthma gets worse. That's a question mark because I've actually seen patients with asthma, when I improved their sleep rhythms, they actually had less asthma. So I don't know if this is a robust connection here. In the GI tract, huge. Melatonin, again, is produced locally and it works as a local antioxidant, but pineal-derived melatonin in the circadian rhythm has been demonstrated to be helpful for GERD. So there are melatonin receptors on the lower esophageal sphincter. So for some patients, we can say GERD actually has different subtypes. There is a nervous type of GERD. And in the nervous type of GERD, that's where melatonin could be very helpful. It improves the epithelial barrier, so leaky gut. Again, in that more nervous type individual, melatonin might be an important role there. Same with irritable bowel syndrome and even IBD. Lots of uses now. You see melatonin being studied in irritable bowel syndrome. So that's, if you wanted to search on PubMed, you'd find some interesting articles there. It's hepatoprotective for the liver, improves insulin resistance, and improves non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And then improves in chronic kidney disease, circadian rhythms, and sleep. So I put all this up here to show that, again, melatonin helps to regulate all the organ functions. And we'll see each hormone in the body does that as well. So I'm just going to go through with each hormone, all these different systems. But I think that helps drive the point home there a little bit. There's a lot of interest looking at melatonin in autism and finding that melatonin is lower in autism spectrum patients. Oops, sorry about that. And then we find that maybe it can help autistic patients with sleep. They're using pretty high doses, again, 2 to 5 milligrams. I typically would recommend melatonin under 3 milligrams, but I'll come to that here in just a moment. So again, where we primarily think of melatonin is with sleep disorders, although I want to emphasize that, again, there's a lot of effects on bone, skin, GI health, and so forth, so we don't want to forget those. But with sleep, it's interesting because we have several different types of sleep disorders. I'll get to those here in just a second. But we have several neurotransmitters and hormones needed for sleep. So melatonin is one, but we need adequate levels of GABA, potentially adenosine, and another one called Ganglion. In wakefulness, we have usually too much dopamine, norepi, serotonin imbalances, acetylcholine, histamine, and orexins. So these are more of our stimulatory neurotransmitters. Now, interestingly, other hormones play into sleep. So estrogen, especially estradiol, upregulates your serotonin. So that's why we find that there's a antidepressive effect of estrogens. Progesterone tends to increase your GABA, and there's several ways it does that. It increases biosynthesis as well as decreasing breakdown. And then testosterone tends to upregulate dopamine, again, through several different mechanisms. So we can think of the progesterone as kind of our sleep-inducing hormone. And so for patients with a lot of anxiety and whatnot, especially with estrogen dominance, that could be one to consider. We'll talk about that in more depth when we talk about the gonads. Sleep, again, we think neurophysiologically has to do with the reticular activating system in the brainstem. This secretes serotonin primarily, as well as other neurotransmitters. This is what increases wakefulness. So it sends neurons into different parts of the cortex to wake you up, essentially. So turning that off is essential for sleep. And we think melatonin is one of the hormones that plays a role there. So this lecture is primarily on melatonin and pineal, so I'm not going to focus in depth on sleep. But again, just to remind you, there are many different types of sleep disorders. So we talk about insomnia. Primary insomnia really is sort of insomnia not associated with other disorders. So secondary, we can have an actual other medical condition or disorder associated with it, and that's what causes the insomnia. But with primary insomnia, we have the dysomnias, which are impairment in the amount, quality, or timing of sleep, and that would be primary insomnia, our most common type. Primary hypersomnia, you sleep too much. Narcolepsy, you fall asleep random times during the day. Circadian rhythm disorder, where your cycle is shifted. So jet lag is one example of that. Patients who have lost optic nerve function, blindness from that reason, also have lost the ability to sense through the retinal cells the blue light, so their suprachiasmatic nuclei get disrupted. So they get circadian rhythm disorders. And then sleep apnea, both central and obstructive. Parasomnias would be weird things like sleepwalking, night terrors, and so forth. And remember that sleep is interesting because you're awake, you then progressively, as you fall asleep, go to slower and slower brain rhythms. You go from beta to alpha to theta, and then you go to delta. And it's in the delta rhythm here, which you only stay in for maybe 10-15 minutes on the first run, and then again on the second run. This is where you actually secrete all of your protective hormones like growth hormone, lots of DHEA and whatnot. So that's the real physiologic restorative time of sleep. Then you pop up to REM, which is actually beta brainwaves again, very active brainwaves. Your body's paralyzed, of course, because in the brainstem, you filter out all your motor impulses, so you move your eyes a lot. That's why it's called rapid eye movement, but your body is paralyzed. But you're in a sympathetic state. You can actually measure stress hormones and whatnot during that state. So this is when most people, if you wake them up during this phase, say that they've been dreaming. So our dream state, or REM state, really is not restful for the body. It does help the brain consolidate memories, but for the body, we really regenerate in this lower state. We go through each cycle in about 90 minutes. We then go into the second cycle, but notice as the night goes on towards morning, you're not getting into the lowest, the slowest, the delta rhythm sleep anymore, and your sleep is more superficial. So you're not as regenerating from that kind of sleep. Melatonin, we know, especially in the higher levels early in the night, really helps get you into those deeper restorative rhythms. I won't talk about restless legs or nocturnal myoclonus, but those would be other types of insomnia. So I put this for your reference, sort of a naturopathic support for primary insomnia. Again, we want to use a therapeutic order. For most patients, though, we don't need to use pharmaceutical interventions for insomnia. We can work first with our diet, reducing inflammation, insulin spikes, that sort of thing, getting adequate proteins, light meals in the evening, and then working at reducing stimulants and alcohol and so forth. Of course, exercise is important, lifestyle, and then mindfulness practices. So that would be our step one in the therapeutic order. For specific nutrients, this would be to upregulate melatonin and GABA. We can think of them as sort of working together. So 5-HTP I've mentioned, and that's typically given 1 up to 300 milligrams about a half an hour to 45 minutes before bed. You start at the lower doses and then build up. And that in and of itself could upregulate your melatonin. You can give larger doses of tryptophan, so some people do that. I tend to like the 5-HTP. B3, niacin, B6, magnesium, zinc, and even essential fatty acids would all help that. Again, I mentioned the iron is in small amounts, so patients with anemia, iron deficiency anemia, might have problems with sleep because of that, so that might be one thing to look at. And then all these important B vitamins. Melatonin, again, there's some question about dosage. I tend to stay low, 0.1 to 1 milligram is my favorite, probably no more than 3 milligrams. There is some concern from earlier studies that larger doses will tend to suppress the endogenous circadian rhythm of the pineal. And that's going to be the case for all hormones taken exogenously. You could suppress the gland by taking it exogenously in high amounts. So that's going to be true for your sex hormones, also true for anybody taking cortisol. Be very careful with that. That can suppress your adrenals. That's why a lot of the conventional endocrinologists frown on the naturopaths talking about adrenal fatigue when a person doesn't really have Addison's. And then they give cortisol supplements as therapy. So that would suppress the adrenal gland even further. So that's the melatonin. Some other nutrients which can help upregulate melatonin would be L-theanine. That's found naturally in green tea. It's an amino acid. Increases GABA and 5-HT dopamine. Improves your alpha wave activity at night, too, at least in animal trials. Taurine reduces cortisol, increases GABA. So we can say there's an indirect effect on melatonin. And then giving GABA directly is another possibility. GABA does not cross the blood-brain barrier. And so the critics of that say, well, you're not able to get it into the brain. But interestingly, in at least animal studies, rat studies, we found that if you give melatonin or GABA orally, it will be sensed by the gut lining. That will trigger through the vagus nerve a reflex where now the brain will start to secrete more GABA. So it's not that the GABA has to pass into you physically, it's through a nerve reflex. Very interesting phenomena. In fact, we're finding that nerve reflex phenomena is probably happening with just about every herb you take, which means that you don't actually have to get the herb into the blood to have an effect on the body. It can work through the nerves. Very profound. It says that a lot of our discussion about standardization and concentration and these, super concentrated extracts might be off base, that we might be able to actually be much more subtle about this. So those would be a couple of amino acids which can support melatonin and secondarily GABA and so forth. I'm not going to say much more about the following slides here. This we can discuss in class in more detail. But basically, when working with insomnia, we don't want to just work with melatonin and GABA. There are different subtypes of insomnia. In fact, we can define what we might call a metabolic subtype, where a person has problems with their liver and insulin responses, and that leads to their insomnia. So that person would not respond well to melatonin or any of those supporting treatments. We also talk about more of a rhythmical subtype, where it's more a problem in the breathing rhythms and circulation, and so that would need a different therapy as well. So this is where I think, again, just when you want to think beyond the gland in this case, beyond the pineal gland, in developing a comprehensive treatment towards insomnia. Again, I can discuss the details of all this more in class. I'm going to end with this final slide. I'm jumping ahead a couple of slides. Again, I'll discuss the other aspects in class if there's interest. But with Nirvine Herbs, these are herbs that essentially have effects on decreasing excess sympathetic nerve activity. They tend to upregulate melatonin and GABA. So they would have a calming effect, and then decreasing glutamate excitotoxicity. So these are herbs, for example, in Chinese medicine, we say they calm the Shen, they reduce the heart qi constraint, and so forth. And we can classify them into excess and deficient patterns. Again, I won't go into that discussion right here, but this is a list of some of the classic nervines we often find helpful in the clinic for improving melatonin. We have some clinical trials on some of these, but not all. But classic herbs like passion flower, the aerial parts of the western skullcap, motherwort, valerian root, lemon balm, lavender, blue vervain. These would all be examples. And these would be more secondary nervines, like the hops. That's more of a phytoestrogen. Chamomile, that works more down on the GI system. Bugleweed, more again with the heart rhythms and hyperthyroidism, things like that. Linden, hawthorn, hibiscus, again more cardiac related. And then deficiency, like the milky oak seed, mimosa, which is albizia. This is a beautiful nervine plant, grows in the tropics. And the ziziphus, a fruit as well. These are very helpful for a more depleted person who's been under a lot of stress. They have more of a what we call a deficiency pattern. They respond better to those herbs. So again, we can discuss these in more detail. In the next slide, I have a little more detail on valerian, just for you to look at. So again, the emphasis of this presentation is more on melatonin and pineal, so we can talk about those later. So that's a wrap on pineal gland and melatonin. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into the gland and some of its pathologies and the diverse physiological effects of melatonin, not just a nighttime hormone, but really has an effect on nearly every organ system. In particular, really interesting effects on bone and on skin health. So that's it for the pineal and melatonin.